Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. My name's Danielle and I'm the owner of Damn Fancy Creations and the Drunk Flamingo Glitter. If you guys are new to my channel, I do want to let you know that all of my groups and links are posted in the description below in case you guys want to check them out. In today's tutorial, we're going to cover everything you see listed here. I'm excited to share this with you guys. It is an exclusive for my Damn Fancy tribe. It involves several different techniques, but if you do them separately, they're not very hard to complete. There's just a lot of steps to this tumbler. If you guys have any questions about anything that I covered in this tutorial, you guys can ask in the comment section or in our Damn Fancy Tribe Facebook group, and I will be happy to answer them for you. But for now, we're going to go ahead and get started on this tumbler, and I hope you guys enjoy. Alright y'all, so first thing you're going to do is spray paint your tumbler in the colors that you want. I chose flat black and vintage blush. Vintage blush is one of my favorite pinks from Rustoleum. It is really hard to find, but stores are starting to come back in with spray paint and I was able to snag a can. I am just applying a very, very thin coat of epoxy. When you do the epoxy method, you really only need about 5 mils of epoxy. We're just spreading it on there to make that base tacky so that our glitter will stick to it. And we're just smoothing all of this on there. I did tape my bottom rim because I did not want to apply glitter all the way to the bottom of the tumbler. I wanted a stainless rim exposed. This is just personal preference. I also went ahead and popped off the bottom of this tumbler. I do have several tutorials on how to do this, including a few lives in the Damn Fancy Tribe Facebook group in case you guys need to see how I do this. And once we have our epoxy on there, our tumbler is completely covered, we're going to apply our glitter. I'm using Revolver and Dusty Rose. Revolver is my extra fine black, and Dusty Rose is one of my most popular whites that is also mixed with a little purple, a little pink, and a little opal. It's one of my favorite whites that we have. So to get started, I am just sprinkling this glitter along the bottom rim. I am applying my lighter color first because if we sprinkled our black first, once we went back and sprinkled our white, it would not show up as well. So we're going to sprinkle our white and then we'll come back and sprinkle a little bit of that black over this white to help get a good gradient. So after I have the majority of the bottom half covered, I am just taking my tea strainer and sprinkling a little bit of this white above and blending it into the black. This tea strainer I got from Walmart years ago. I don't think that they still have this exact one, but there are several on Amazon that you can find. So now that I have my white on, I'm going to fill my tea strainer with the black. And I am just going to sprinkle this on the top half. And as I'm sprinkling this on the tumbler, you guys can see me kind of raise my hand a little bit. So the higher you hold your tea strainer, the more spread out your glitter will fall. And it will fall more sparse on the tumbler and not as concentrated. So you can get a good gradient that way. I know it's kind of hard to see what I'm doing with my hand, like directly over the tumbler. And I am just sprinkling this black on there until I feel like it is even across the epoxy. There's no weird streaks or wet spots. Then I am also taking the white again, and we're just sprinkling a little bit more on top of the black to kind of blend that line a little better. Holding the tea strainer a little higher, a little lower. So once you're happy with your glitter coverage, you're going to remove that tape. Then once this cures, we're going to apply 2 more coats of epoxy, and then we will be ready for our next step. So for our next step to make the web, we're going to be using spider gel. It is basically a stringy gel nail polish. I was really hoping to use an actual spider web, but I do not have any around here that were good enough to use on the tumbler. So I wanted to find a way to get a more realistic spider web than just vinyl. And I decided to try out this spider gel, and I was really happy with the results. So to apply the spider gel, I'm just using a small dotting tool. You can also use a silicone brush. You can use a toothpick. It doesn't really matter. I just like to use the dotting tools because I'm able to load the tool with a lot of the gel. And I'm basically just going back and forth, laying the spider web lines on top of each other, layering them, giving them some dimension, 3D look. And any of the gel that you get on the bottom of the cup, you can just wipe off with acetone or alcohol once you get done. I made some of my lines thicker, some thinner. So I was pretty happy with this. Now I had to decide how I was going to place the little, I don't even know what you call them, the curved lines of the spider web. I tried to kind of loop them and just lay them on the tumbler, but that did not work as well. They were getting kind of caught on the tumbler, and they would have some sharp lines. So I decided to just kind of draw them on with the spider gel. So my ball tool is physically touching the tumbler when I do this. I am not looping anything. I am just kind of drawing them. And then we're dipping a little bit more of that spider gel. And then I'm going to move on to the next line. You will be able to see it a little bit better once I get some more lines on here. Some of them are very light, but that is kind of the look I was going for because spider webs are pretty transparent. So I'm just picking up a little bit at a time. And during this scene, the spider gel did fall off, stick to my leg, and got all over my thigh that I had to clean off with alcohol really quick. So I am just looping or drawing really these little curves together. And spider gel can get very messy. I typically just dip a little bit in the pot and loop it around so that that string breaks off and it's not going everywhere. I did have a few flyaways when I was doing this, but I really wasn't too concerned about it because this is supposed to be a spider web, and you know, spider webs aren't perfect. They get blown around in the wind. The little spider web threads go kind of crazy. So it just kind of added to the more realistic look. So I'm just going to speed this part up a little bit. but you guys can still watch it if you need to see exactly how I do these little steps. So we're basically just going to do this all the way up the web. And the further back the web goes, the more spaced out my little curved lines will get. And once you get done with this spider gel, I prefer to use the sun to cure any type of UV gel, UV resin. So I will just put this on a noodle or take it outside and just leave it in the sun for about 5 minutes and let everything cure really, really good. And once it is dry to the touch and there's no gooey spots on it or sticky spots on it, I will clean up any of the bottom residue if I didn't get it all off, and then I will put it on my turner for 1 or 2 layers of epoxy. And when that epoxy is cured, we will be ready for our next step. Okay, so now that our tumbler has been epoxied, I went ahead and sanded around the rim. I sanded any spots on the spider gel that could be bumpy and affect the look of our decals. And I printed out this decal. I arranged it in silhouette before I cut it out to make sure that everything would fit well. And we're going to apply our skeleton hand first, so that we can line up the text how we want it. And this little skeleton hand is just going to be our guide. So you're not going to see the color underneath it. So it doesn't really matter what color you cut it out in. I just did black because it went with the top of the tumbler and it wouldn't be very noticeable if any lines were showing. Then we're going to go ahead and line up our decal. Coffins, covens, and cold brews. I thought this was perfect for fall and Halloween. And if I have a lot of text like this, sometimes I do one line at a time, just to make sure that everything is lined up as best as I can get it. And then I realized that one of my little dots was missing, but luckily it was still stuck to the black vinyl that was in my scrap pile. So I was able to find it. Usually I don't find little pieces like this until 2 days later when I find it stuck to a pair of my shorts or something. So I was lucky this time. But a tip, if you cannot find a little tiny piece of vinyl that you're missing, you can always go in with a paint pen and just add a little dot. And anytime that I'm using holographic or metallic vinyl, I am very careful when I am removing it from the backing, because if it gets bent a little bit, you will be able to see it under epoxy. So I just carefully remove it, making sure not to bend or rip any of this vinyl. And then we're going to apply this to the cup. And I like to use lined transfer tape because it's really easy for me to match up the vinyl and get it straight. And I usually smooth it down in the center, and then I smooth out both sides. That way nothing is going to get crinkled or off center. And here's how our cup is looking so far. I really like how it's coming together. And after all of our vinyl is on, we're going to break out the Culture Sculpt and start sculpting our skeleton peace sign hand. So I'm going to get everything ready, and then I will kind of tell you guys why I decided to use Culture Sculpt for this project versus other sculpting materials that I could use. So of course we have our Culture Sculpt, then we also have our silicone tools. This is so we can shape the Culture Sculpt, we can get in between little cracks. I'm also going to be using cornstarch because it will prevent my hands or my tools from actually sticking to the Culture Sculpt. So I'm just getting a little bit on the lid of my cornstarch just so I have some handy. I'm also using gloves. You do not want to use Culture Sculpt without gloves. When CC DIY first came out with this product, they sent it to me to test out, and I did not know that you were supposed to use gloves, and my hands were burning for an entire day because I just thought it was like clay. It is not. You have to use gloves. It does have an odor, so if you are sensitive to smells, I would suggest doing this outside. I typically work with this outside, but since I was using such a small amount of it today, I just did it in my office, and the smell was not very strong. With Culture Sculpt, it is a 2-part sculpting epoxy. So you want to get out equal parts of A and B, and we're going to mix them together. Whenever I am mixing up Culture Sculpt, for some reason, the episode of Schitt's Creek pops into my mind when David is talking about folding in the cheese when they're cooking. I don't know why. It just brings back that memory for me. So you're basically just folding the Culture Sculpt into each other just to mix up those separate parts and get it combined. And you guys can see in the video that one part is a little more yellow and one part is a little more white. When you are mixing your Culture Sculpt, you will be able to see the two different colors. You are going to mix it until the colors are pretty even, that there are no more striations of white or cream. We want it all one color. And if you are new to Culture Sculpt, I do suggest just mixing up a small piece at a time because it does cure just like regular epoxy. So if you mix a whole lot, then it could flash cure on you, and then you would waste all of that Culture Sculpt. I also am sticking a noodle in my tumbler because if you have Culture Sculpt residue on your gloves and then you touch your tumbler, that residue is going to be on your tumbler. So we want to try not to touch our tumbler when we're doing this. So stick a noodle in there or any other, turner arm that you use to hold your cups. And I was actually surprised that this really did not take as much Culture Sculpt as I thought it was going to. I know my hand is relatively small, But basically what we're going to do is put a small piece of Culture Sculpt onto our vinyl template, and then we are going to shape it with our silicone tools. And this piece I think was a little bit too big. There's too much Culture Sculpt on this, so I did take it off and went back with a smaller piece. And it was at this time that I realized that I mixed up a little bit too much. So for a hand this size, I would probably use a quarter size amount of A and B and mix it together, because I did have a lot of Culture Sculpt left over. And with Culture Sculpt, it is a little bit different texture than polymer clay. It kind of has the texture of like that modeling clay from Crayola. It's a very light texture. Model Magic, I think it's called. So we are just going to apply this Culture Sculpt on top of our vinyl template. And I like to kind of take my piece of Culture Sculpt and I will press it onto the vinyl until it forms that bond. If you just put it on there, it will likely just fall off. But if you kind of hold it there for a second, the Culture Sculpt will kind of get a little sticky or tacky and it will grip onto the vinyl, and then you'll be able to kind of form it with those silicone tools. I hope that makes sense to you guys. And now I will kind of explain why I used Culture Sculpt versus other sculpting products that you could use. If you guys have watched my tutorial or been a part of my group, you know that I've used polymer clay, air dry clay, Culture Sculpt, different types of sculpting materials. Polymer clay is an oven bake clay, so obviously that would not work on this particular tumbler because we already have epoxy on this cup. So we could not put the polymer clay on this tumbler and then bake it. That just would not work. Now you could get a blank tumbler, put the template on there, make the skeleton hand, and then pop off those little clay pieces and bake them. But then you run into the issue of them not lying correctly on a glittered tumbler after they were baked. It might work, I'm not sure. Now you could also use air dry clay, but air dry clay does dry pretty quickly. I typically only use air dry clay if I am doing a very small section of 3D elements, or if I'm using molds. Air dry clay is good for that, but air dry clay does shrink up a little bit, so I didn't want it to shrink funny on my tumbler and then reveal the vinyl underneath. Polymer clay and air dry clay can also be a little heavy, and I wanted this tumbler to stay pretty light. And Epoxy Sculpt, or Culture Sculpt as it's now called, does have a decently long work time. I believe I worked with this small piece that I mixed up for about 45 minutes. And I still had probably about 10 more minutes left than I could work with it. I could tell at the end of this video that the Culture Sculpt was getting a little warm, which means it was starting to cure on me. So this little piece was having a hard time sticking. This is what I was kind of talking about earlier. To get it to stick, you really kind of have to hold it on there. But it was wanting to stick to my gloves as well. So I just kind of reformed it and kind of held it there for just a second until it kind of stuck to that vinyl. And then I could form it with my tools. So I'm going to speed this up just a little bit so you guys can see how I completed the whole hand, but not sit here for an hour and watch me do it in real time. So now everything is very sped up. So for like the finger bones, I really kind of formed them a little beforehand before sticking them on to the vinyl. So I made the middle a little bit more skinny and then the ends a little more thicker. And I don't know what any of these bones are called. I know Rachel's probably watching this making fun of me because I don't know what they're called. But I don't. They're just bones. Finger bones. Hand bones. And if you notice that your silicone tools are kind of sticking to the culture sculpt, you can just dip your little silicone tool in our little mountain of cornstarch and it will prevent them from sticking. And that was Birdie that just bumped our tripod stand. She always wants attention when I'm not playing with her. So this is pretty much what we're going to do for our entire hand. We're just going to press down that epoxy sculpt and use our silicone tools to form the shape around the vinyl. And I'm really not worried about getting the epoxy sculpt or culture sculpt. I keep calling it epoxy sculpt because that's what they used to call it. But I'm not too worried about getting the culture sculpt smooth or perfect or anything because they are bones. I am going to go back and distress them anyway. I just want to get that shape right. And some of these little pieces were super tiny and a little hard to get on there. My cup was a little smaller, but I really like this size tumbler. This is the 16-ounce junior from Steel Magnolias. So if you think you have this part down, if you don't want to watch me stick every little piece of culture sculpt onto our little vinyl template, you can skip ahead probably 5 minutes in the video and then we will be on to our next step. But I know a lot of you guys like to watch every single little thing that I do if you guys are visual learners. So I am just going to let this play. And I also wanted to point out that sometimes your culture sculpt will get contaminated with random stuff you have on your desk, like glitter. And you guys can see I have like a few glitter flakes in my culture sculpt. I'm going to go back later and just pick out some of those with little tweezers that I have. But for this particular project, I didn't necessarily mind it because it kind of added to the aged, creepy, decaying feel of the skeleton hand. And a lot of times, if I use culture sculpt, it's going to be painted afterwards anyway. You can also sand culture sculpt if you want to get it smooth, but this project we did not sand because I liked the texture. And we are about halfway through our hand right now, and I was really liking how it was coming together. Can y'all hear the squirrels in the background? They're so loud today. There's a lot of them. Not as many birds out today, but lots of squirrels. And you guys do see me using the cornstarch a little bit more right now. The closer the culture sculpt gets to curing, the more tacky it gets. Like it's kind of been sitting for a little while, so it's starting to get a little tacky. So I just apply a little cornstarch. You do have to be careful about how much cornstarch you use, because if you get the cornstarch on the vinyl, then it's not going to stick as well. So you do have to be a little bit mindful of that, or just be sure to wipe off the vinyl before you put the culture sculpt on, so it will stick well. And for the little hand bones, I just kind of put several little pieces up there to help them go ahead and form that bond with the vinyl, so that when I came back with my silicone tools to kind of detail them, they were already stuck pretty well, so that I could shape them a little bit more easily. And then I go in with my really skinny silicone brush and kind of form those deep lines. And we're almost done, guys. So the skeleton hand in total took me probably about 45 minutes to complete. It probably would have taken me the same amount of time if I would have used polymer clay. Now, I know that there are probably molds that you can buy out there. I'm not really sure. I know there's like a middle finger mold out there, but I didn't want to do a middle finger skeleton. I wanted to do the peace sign. But I do like the idea of sculpting one yourself, because then you can kind of make it whatever size you want to. If we used a larger tumbler, we could make our skeleton hand larger. If we did a smaller mug, we could make our skeleton hand smaller. With mold, you're kind of restricted to that one size. So now I'm just kind of adding some texture to our skeleton hand, and I will detail him with my brushes, clean up any residue with alcohol. And once Epoxy Sculpt dries, or Culture Sculpt, sorry, I keep calling it Epoxy Sculpt, I will put it on the turner for one layer of epoxy, which I will show you guys next. Typically, Culture Sculpt dries in a matter of hours. I like to wait a full 24 hours, especially if I do something like my ice cream scoops or something thicker, because sometimes it takes a lot longer to dry, especially the interior parts. On a piece that is as thin as this, I would say probably a couple hours. But before we epoxy, I am going to age it a little bit. I could just leave it white, but I am going to age it and distress it to kind of look like a more realistic skeleton hand, because skeleton bones are not white, they are dirty and creepy looking. So that is what we're going to do to our hand. So I am using Latte and Carmel alcohol inks to kind of dye our Epoxy Sculpt and give it kind of a tannish brown tint. I'm just brushing on a little bit at a time because I wasn't really sure what color it was going to be. And once I have a little bit of that ink on there, I am going to go back and wipe it with alcohol to kind of blend it really well and to really just kind of dye the Culture Sculpt. So I am speeding this up a little bit more. I am just coloring this. Then I'm going to get my alcohol. This is 91% alcohol. And I am just rubbing all of those bones, kind of blending in that ink. So I'm almost kind of wiping it all off. Now I'm going to break out some darker colors. I believe I'm using Fog and Slate by Bria Reese, and we're just dabbing on some of this dark gray, and then we're also going to take our alcohol and just kind of blend all of that in. But I still wanted a little bit more texture on my bones. So after my little bones were basically aged and dyed, I decided to get some acrylic paint and a sponge. I'm just using white and black. And we're just using a small little sponge. And we're just going to dab on some of this color. So we have some variation between the white and the brown and the black. And I'm just doing a little at a time. And then I'm going to go in with a little bit of this black. And we're just kind of layering our colors until we get the look we want. Obviously, if you want your skeleton bones just to stay white, then you don't have to do any of this. But I just like to show you guys different options. And then I'm using a fresh side of the sponge, and we're just kind of blending that paint just a little bit. And once this dries, we are ready for epoxy. I did not seal the paint or anything. I just took this straight from upstairs to downstairs. I'm also going to use a little brush to help epoxy the hand. And I will say that if you're using Culture Sculpt for something like ice cream scoops, you don't have to epoxy over it because it is a sculpting epoxy. It is not going to break. Water's not going to dissolve it. For my ice cream scoops, I just scoop them out and let them dry and then drill my straw hole. But since we did paint this and it's not necessarily attached to the tumbler itself, it's more attached to the vinyl, a couple layers of epoxy is going to ensure that everything is covered and is going to stay in place. So even if you don't paint or ink your skeleton hand, I do suggest epoxying over it. So we're just epoxying our tumbler like normal right now. I am getting all in these little crevices. And once we get our cup completely covered, we are going to take our brush and we are going to get any excess epoxy off of the skeleton hand, get it out of all those little crevices so they're not filled with bubbles. I am first just kind of wiping everything to make sure it's all covered. And then I am just getting off the excess that I can with my fingers. And now I'm going to go in with my paintbrush and we're just going to wipe along those fingers. Wipe along the bones, any of those crevices, and we're just going to get out any of that extra epoxy. You can also use your silicone tools for this. I did use my silicone tools on the second coat of epoxy I did, but brushes will work as well. Especially since this is the first layer of epoxy, I wanted to kind of get out as much of that excess epoxy that I could, and a brush is a really good way to do that. So I'm just kind of going in between the bones, in between the hand bones, and just wiping all that epoxy out. And once you're happy with how your hand looks, I'm going to take some acetone in a little cup and we're going to clean our brush. This is how I keep my brushes from getting ruined. I typically have one brush that I keep for epoxy and UV resin, and I clean them each time. I just pour a little bit of acetone into a plastic disposable cup, and I just dip it in there, slosh it around, and then dry it off with a towel. Do it one more good time, and then your brush should be pretty clean. I will take this inside and wash it with some Dawn dish soap, but it will be as good as new and ready for the next time you use it. So I will do one more coat of epoxy after this one cures. I will do the same thing, making sure all the epoxy is out of the little cracks. And then the bulk of the tumbler will be complete. This is what it looks like right now. So now we're going to do the little glitter butt. I mixed up about 20 mils of epoxy, and we're going to use Revolver and Jack Frost Cocktail. I started with Jack Frost Cocktail, which is a kind of a slate gray, and this is going to go in the first cavity of the glitter butt. So we're just going to pour in a little bit of epoxy at a time. I did measure this out before, and I think it takes about 5 mils to fill this exterior cavity. And then just to get a little bit of a color definition, I am going to add some Revolver into this same mixture. Just to make it a little darker. And we're going to mix this up and pour it in the center cavity. I am going to pop all of these bubbles, let it cure. And once this layer of epoxy has cured, I'm going to go back with a thin layer of clear epoxy so that the bottom of our tumbler is just as glass-like and slick as the rest of our tumbler. And once that layer of epoxy dries, your tumbler will be complete. So I know this was a lot of steps, but I hope you guys like the end result. I hope y'all try this tumbler because I think it's super fun. Here is Jackie Skellington with her tumbler. She was so excited to share it with everybody. And here are the finished pictures of the cup. I really think that detailing the hand with the inks and acrylic paint just kind of put this tumbler over the top. It just gives it a more realistic, creepy feel. If you guys try this tumbler, please post in the group because I love to see your guys' creations. If y'all enjoyed this tutorial or learned something new, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Don't forget to catch the next video coming up that was picked just for you. As always, if you're looking for more tips, tricks, or tutorials, be sure to check out my tutorial group on Facebook or my mentorship group. Both are linked in the description. Thanks for watching.